I know, and it's been referred to already at ELF so far, and I know much of the last 2 years has felt like a loss when it comes to discipleship, disciple-making, leadership, ministry, the church. And I know that the pandemic looked different and has looked differently in different countries. But generally, we have experienced the pause, we experienced the pause to many regular disciple-making activities. Many of us, in many of our countries, public worship, okay, that would have been a given, a normal routine certainly been the dominant routine for all of my life, and as a Christian. Didn't happen for at least 4 or 5 months. Beyond that 4 or 5 month period, there were restrictions on church gatherings for up to 2 years in my context, in my country. In some places and in some cases, we've seen this has caused a drop in attendance when the church were able to regather again. Camps, conferences, residential activities that many parachurch organizations and ministries led with or facilitated were cancelled or haven't happened in the way that they once did. There's been a lack of face-to-face connection that suffered. We've tried to learn to communicate behind masks in some cases. There's been the slow return of Christian ministry activities. There's been a loss of some people in the church, and there's been a loss of some leaders who lead and volunteer and serve within the church. What a disaster. What a disaster for disciple making. It's felt like retreat and restrictions and limitations and loss, and we've downsized, and it's felt like defeat. How on earth could the church, could disciple-making activity recover from all of that? And we shouldn't underestimate the impact of any of this upon the lives of ordinary disciples. The disruption of regular church attendance can cause and has caused in some a shifting in habits. People's habits have changed, we're told. There's having a loss of missional experiences or even mountaintop moments, I think can cause and create apathy. I'm not saying this is right, but as an 18, 19, 20-year-old Christian, I lived off the summer mission experiences that I had. I spiritually lived off the retreats that I got to go on, the residentials I was at. Now, I'm not saying that's a healthy way to live as a Christian, but at that moment, I was sparked or encouraged or engaged in different ways than I was throughout the year. And in some ways, it sustained my faith from one year or one summer to the next. Some people, maybe around that age group, have lost that. There's been less opportunity for spiritual formation, when there's less opportunity for spiritual formation or Bible teaching, it can create a vacuum that some people seek to fill in other ways. Various opinions about, and I think, David, you hinted at this, about unity, various opinions about government restrictions or even vaccines can cause conflict, can create disunity in the church, and all of this has had an impact. Some of you right now are thinking, when's he going to get to the good news? This isn't too hopeful. I came here to be encouraged at ELF. This isn't encouraging, okay? But a church leader who I was talking to last year in my nation told me this. He said this. He said, COVID hasn't changed anything about our church. It's an interesting thing to say, isn't it? He said, COVID hasn't changed anything about our church. He said, it has revealed everything. Do you see it? Okay. In his view, COVID hadn't changed the reality in their church because the reality of what they were seeing was already there. And maybe you can relate to that. And I heard a few nods, or saw a few nods in the head that you would say that might be the same for you. In many parts of Europe, we saw it this morning on the screen, physical church attendance has been in decline for many years. In many churches, some regular attenders have already carried a more nominal faith. These things weren't caused by COVID, but they might have become more obvious or evident or even urgent. And I think in many ways the last couple of years have acted like a dye that gets injected into an environment and it reveals what really is already there. And I think that's true. I think in some ways the COVID pandemic has shone a spotlight, or it's been like a dye that has revealed what's really there in the lives of ordinary disciples and within the church or within our ministries and activities as well. What has it shown? Well, I think it's shown that there is always a need to prepare disciples for challenges. If you're a part of this network last year, we thought a lot about that. I think the pandemic has revealed that. How well are we preparing people? I think it's revealed a need to help disciples to think critically about cultural issues and pressures that come along, to think with wisdom about what happens. There's always been a need, I think, to help parents to disciple their kids. But whenever a lot of church activities stopped for children or young people, I think it revealed the need for parents to really take responsibility for their children's faith or for spiritual formation in the home. I think there's always been a need to emphasize the benefits of gathering as a church. But I think whenever those things were paused or stopped or people began replacing that with other things, I think the pandemic has revealed the need for it. And of course, there are positives, and there have been positives. God has been working, and there has been fresh approaches, and there are encouraging stories to tell. But I think generally this time has revealed those who are nominal, those who were shallow. We'll think about that in a moment. Those who were nominal, those who were shallow in their faith, but it's also highlighted, I think, a committed core. So those who were nominal, people who maybe gave lip service, disciples who gave lip service to their faith, but they didn't really follow Jesus. I think they have generally replaced Christian activity with just something else in their life. They've found something better to entertain them or keep them occupied or amused. I think there were those who were shallow. Maybe I hinted at that about myself earlier as a younger Christian. Maybe those who relied on a program, or they relied on an experience, they relied on a residential, they relied on someone else. They relied on even attending church to be fed themselves, but they found that maybe faith has been a struggle when they've been left on their own or when they've been faced with trials or tests. They've experienced a spiritual disconnection. Those who were shallow have suffered. And I'm going to be sharing in one of the post-forum workshops on Thursday and looking at one of the parables of Jesus in Matthew 13, the parable of the sower, that kind of reveals different responses or different needs. And then it's also revealed what I'm calling, and I've called in some writing that I've done, the resilient, the resilient, committed core, resilient disciples who have continued to stand firm in Christ and have found a way to stay connected to the bride of Christ or to serve in His kingdom no matter what. Even when so many barriers were placed in front of them, they still found a way. And actually, I would argue, and I might argue this if there's time at the very end in more depth, but I would argue that the very challenges that have come along have actually created a strength in some. And so in some ways, I might argue that what we have seen in the last 2 years has caused a weakening in the fringe and a strengthening in the core. You might see that differently where you are. That's fine, but that's what I've seen, where I've been standing from. And what I want to do today is, in this session, is I want to explore probably 5 different ways that I think the pandemic has caused us to look at things a little bit differently. And for me, what I'm not going to do today is share with you, here are the answers, here are what we should do, but I'm going to pose them probably more as questions or issues or tensions that we're seeing, and then get you around your tables to talk about what that might look like in your contexts and how we might respond. For me, these are 5 needs or 5 spotlights that have been shone, things that have been shown on. I'm going to suggest 5 things that I think it's kind of showing a need for, and I'm trying to look forward. Okay, so I'm not trying to say this is how a church should have responded 2 years ago, or this is what we should have done. Someone said to me, maybe 6 months into all of, September 2020, someone said, I can honestly stand here and say, we've done the best that we can with the knowledge that we had. And he said, we made mistakes and we didn't get it all right, but we did the best. And I think that's fair. So I'm not trying to, look back and criticize. I'm trying to look forward and say, what has this taught us and how do we look forward, okay? I've called them key principles. I actually think that's probably over-egging it slightly, okay? But these are just some thoughts, I suppose, and as I say, we'll bounce them around in the table. But one of the first things I want to talk about is the need that I think it's shown on to resource people beyond the moment, okay? I'll explain that in a moment, okay? The need to resource people beyond the moment. I think many disciple makers have been dealing with the reality that some people's engagement with Christian activity has been reduced. Some people's life patterns have changed. Some people have been engaging with church digitally, maybe some not at all. Some are being discipled by podcasts or online church when it's convenient for them. That's maybe in some context. I'm aware we have a brother and sister today who normally minister in Ukraine, and so they've been dealing with displaced discipleship in many ways, as well as you seek to continue to influence people's lives. So, and we'll talk about technology in a moment, okay? So there is a need, and technology can really serve the purposes of discipleship, but also I think we need to be cautious as well about where we use it and how we lean on it. And what times we do that on. But no matter what, whenever people are with us, in whatever format they're with us, we've got to be thinking about how we are resourcing them for beyond that moment. So it's not actually about the time that they're with us. It's about how the time that they are with us is actually preparing them for whatever reality they're going to walk into or face. So on a big picture level, preparing them for future life events and life decisions, but also on a shorter term thinking, also preparing them for their everyday life as well. My question is, how are we going to form people with more spiritual depth? How can this be not about this, but about for that, if that makes sense? How can this be for that? And Ollie Magnus talked about the over-dependency on programs. And I think that has been something that has been exposed, that whenever the program was taken away, where in many cases it was, we had to scramble and think, oh my goodness, the program is gone. How are we going to disciple people now? Is the program effectively discipling people? And if so, that's great. But if not, then how do we review that? Jesus said this. He said, abide in me and I in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do a few things. No. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Remain in me, Jesus says. Disciples will not grow without learning to abide in Jesus. And so my challenge, I think the need is that our need is to teach people to abide. To teach people to remain in Jesus whenever they're with us and whenever they're not. What is their dependency in? Who is their dependency on? If it is dependent on a program, then actually maybe we've missed it. Now, initially, and I could think of some people who've come into the life of our church from outside it, who have come to faith, maybe through things like Alpha, or initially in those type of dependency. There is going to be more dependency at the start of a relationship, okay, or at the start of a journey. And we at home, I've left behind a 3-week-old baby at home. So probably too early to be here if I'm very, very honest. But anyway, we're dealing with that. And we had a little baby girl 3 weeks ago, and her dependency on us, especially on her mother, for food and for life, is huge. Our 9-year-old at home is not just as dependent. He can now walk himself to school, and so dependency does change. And so I'm not criticizing, but as we make disciples, there might be a need for more dependency on a disciple maker at the early part of a journey, okay? But our goal should be to try to move them from dependency on us or our programs or our activities into a really dependency on Christ, no matter whether those programs are there or not. How are we teaching people? This is my question. It's not how are we teaching people what it means to abide? And David was using a brilliant example of what a lot of churches did, and my own church did this as well, that in the immediate days of lockdown began to teach the Bible on YouTube or daily devotional content or sharing that online. And I think that is a brilliant opportunity in discipleship to resource people beyond the moment, to think about how, if we are giving teaching at church, if we are in a discipleship group, what content or what challenge can we be providing people with beyond the time they're with us? So it's not just about coming to church and hearing a brilliant sermon for 30 minutes, but actually here's 3 questions for you to talk about around your kitchen table. Here's a passage or a set of passages for you to read during the week to consider this. Here's a chapter of a book that will help you to think more about what we're doing. How are we thinking about the activities that we're doing and almost signposting or launching people or pushing people towards something beyond that will deepen them? But just an observation about the daily content was that I think after a couple of months, some churches realized this is not sustainable. For the rest, we can't carry on, and maybe some churches could, great, but we can't carry on just providing a YouTube clip every week or every day for our people. And I do wonder if some churches panicked, my own included, panicked initially, thinking, oh my goodness, they're not going to be with us at church, so we need to provide something for them, because if we don't provide something for them, they're not going to read the Bible. Let me pick now. I've talked about my youngest child, and I've talked about my oldest child, the middle child. And I think I've talked about this before in a webinar with ELF last year. The middle child is 4 years old. The biggest battle of our last year with him is teaching him to eat his breakfast. We have reached the point where it's been really difficult, okay? It's not a big deal, but sitting beside him every morning is teaching him that he needs to learn how to feed himself. So 2 years ago, we were spoon feeding him. We were putting the spoon into his mouth. Last year, you need to pick up the spoon and eat for yourself, because we're trying to move. We can't follow him around with a spoon for the rest of his life. So for people's spiritual growth, are we spoon feeding them the answers, or are we helping them to feed themselves? How in our discipleship can we train people? Train people to read the Bible for themselves, to pray for themselves, to discern for themselves as well. How are we teaching people beyond the moment? Last little thing on this, okay? I think of Daniel and his friends. And as Daniel and his friends arrived, probably as teenagers in Babylon, into a brand new culture that didn't follow the principles and practices of the Jerusalem that they had grown up and been familiar with, these young men continued to follow the practices that they had learned in a foreign land, in exile. My question is, who was Daniel's youth leader? Who discipled Daniel? Who prepared people? Who prepared Daniel for Babylon? Who trained him to think in such a way that he could go into a new environment and learn to accept some of the things that came his way, to learn the literature and the language of the Babylonian, but not accept the new diet that he was offered? To accept the new names that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were given, but not bow down to the idols? Who prepared them? Who resourced them for their future reality? How can we help and think and train people for their future reality, whether it involves suffering or tests or trials, or the fact that they're not going to be with our program anymore in a couple of years, or they might not even be attending our church in 3 years because they might be in another city for work or for whatever reason. How are we preparing people? Secondly, and this is maybe, there's a slight danger here that I'm reflecting on my own context, and this isn't a European thing, so I'll accept that. But I think it perhaps has shown that there's a need in some places to change our pace, to change our activity, our level of activity. In the early weeks of lockdown, many church programs stopped, and the focus became on how we maintained and developed supportive relationships, not beneficial programs. And you know what? If I'm honest, there was something really valuable and almost sacred, I think, in some of those times. Church had always, for me, been a hive of activity, but I wonder if we had lost something in our busyness, where we over-relied on programs to the detriment of relationship, where we'd bought into the frantic pace of the world and not really been a place of rest for the weary. Personally, are we making space for relationships? In our churches or parachurches or ministries, are we making space in those programs? Please don't hear me today, the programs are bad, but are we making space in the programs for that to enhance and develop relationships? I honestly wonder at times if Christian activism has almost led to physical exhaustion or even spiritual apathy in some, where they see themselves just as volunteers in the church to keep things moving and ticking over, and not really people who are there, that their purpose is there. The purpose of the church is to help them to grow in faith. Often I've heard people say, in our context before, a new couple join a church or a new person comes to the church, and people think, great, what can they do for us? And the first thought of a church should not be, what can you do for us, but how will we help you to grow? And then how will you help others in the community to do the same? It's different. Some activities still need to be run. Volunteering and Christian service is still helpful and actually an important point of growth, but it's not actually the goal. And I've heard somebody say, a church leader say, the reason they prefer going for a walk in the park sometimes over attending church is because no one asks them to push the swings in the park. They can enjoy it. So I think we need to work out our pace and our level of activities and whether that's sustainable. And what activities really change people or shape people spiritually. If the activities that we're doing aren't really shaping people spiritually, maybe there's a question about whether they're needed at all. And then we should ask what activities really shape people spiritually and do those. Compared to the rabbis of his day, with their endless rules and regulations and restrictions, Jesus offered a light burden and an easy yoke. And I think that's worth reflecting on. That's probably the passage I've reflected on most within the past year. As I seek to lead within our church, as I seek to disciple others, as I seek to train leaders, am I providing an easy yoke and a light burden? Because if I'm not, maybe I'm placing demands on people that Jesus hasn't actually placed on them. Come to me, Jesus said, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. I think, again, in my context, this time has exposed those who feel weary and who maybe have enjoyed some of the shackles being lifted off them. So I think there's a need to consider our activity levels in relation to our capacity levels. And that could be personal or it could be within our ministry as well. What's our capacity as well? And then the last one for now, I've got 5 today, but I'll comment on this one. The need for companions over content. Okay, the need for companions over content. Or the tension between face-to-face community and digital connection, bearing in mind what I said earlier about the necessity at times to use that. A little phrase I heard last year, technology is the servant of ecclesiology. Not the other way around. I'll say that again. Technology is the servant of ecclesiology, the church. not the other way around. And I think during COVID, rightly, many of our focuses was on how do we get church or Christian activity online, okay? And that was an emergency response, and that was the right thing to do. But I think we need to move from response mode to recovery mode. And so in a natural disaster, people do things out of an emergency response, but after a while, there's a need to shift from that mode into thinking longer term. As we think longer term about discipleship, I think we need to not just be interested in digital connection, but in actually drawing people into face-to-face community. What did Paul write? Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our very lives as well. For me, this is just the perfect definition of discipleship. Sharing the gospel of God, but sharing our lives as well. Now, ironically, Paul was writing this from a distance. Okay? So there is still a moment, there is still an opportunity, there is still a benefit to distant discipleship. Okay? There's still a benefit to that. So I think we can use technology. I think we can use letters and emails, by the way. I'm reading a book, The Letters of Jack Miller at the minute, and just incredible book, and the letters that he wrote to missionaries actually all across Europe. So there's a place for kind of distant discipleship, but I think we also need to emphasize, and I think the need going forward, particularly now in this season, in most contexts, not all, but is to really press into face-to-face connection and community and rebuild that community. I heard someone say in a mentoring conversation I had this morning, they said, how can we compete in the world, 21st century world of all this digital content? Hannah, to pick up your point, how can we compete in a world of all sorts of content that people are accessing? And I think one of the ways that we compete or counteract that is by getting people around a table or in a room or in our home, and we build face-to-face, real relational community with them. Last little thing on this. The Barna Group, who are a brilliant Christian research group based in the US, who conduct kind of Christian research, really. They conducted a study of 27,000 interviews of what they call millennials, okay, 18 to 30s, really. And you know what they came up with? The number one thing, okay, that churches successfully engaging millennials made room for, what was it? What was the number one thing? Meaningful relationships. That's the number one thing that 27,000 18 to 30s said about what helped them in their faith development. Meaningful relationships through mentoring, actually. Okay, meaningful relationships through mentoring, and that was both formal and informal. The number one way we can reach the next generation is if we treat church as a family and not a factory. If we don't just see the program, but we operate and draw people in the family. Now, the program might be the starting point, but how are we drawing people? How are we knowing people's names and their need? How are we modeling, we in our group earlier, modeling a different way of leadership that's relational. It's not just shouting truth from a distance, but modeling it up close, opening our homes and our lives. I'm almost scared to say the next one because there's a danger people hear it wrong, okay? And I have talked about this in my own context and people heard it wrong, okay? So this comes with a health warning, but we're going to talk about the balance between the core and the fringe. And I did talk earlier about how I have seen in our context how in some ways the core has been strengthened and the fringe has perhaps grown in a way because more people have drifted to that where I am. But also in my experience, I think church leaders can become so focused on getting those from the fringe back in, that they don't give enough attention to investing in the core and equipping them to send them out. Okay. What I'm not saying is that what I'm not saying is that drawing people in and continuing to seek to draw people into the church is not important. That is a huge task, but it's a task for the whole community. It's a task of prayer, too. And actually, sometimes I wonder if we're fishing in the wrong pond. If we're fishing so much in the pond of the people who have somehow been inoculated almost, to use, sorry Hannah, there's a vaccination term, but almost who have got a little bit and have chosen not to be present with the church, even though they know where we are. But we haven't given enough attention to fishing in the big wide ocean of the people who have never heard and never been with us. And so what is the balance between the core, the fringe, and the lost? What's the balance that we need to strike in our disciple making? And I think for some of our disciple making, so to give an example, a friend of mine who leads a church in Belfast often says that the fringe for him is the most draining place to minister. Because generally you're working with people who know where you are and have chosen not to be there for whatever reason. He finds it a draining place. Now, there are some people who are gifted to work there, and that is great. And we need to still keep inviting and being open. But how can we also invest in the core so that we can enable them to reach out missionally? Do you see the difference? Investing in a core to enable and equip them to draw in and to reach out, rather than just us standing in the center saying, you need to get back here. If cultural Christianity is decreasing, I think it is, by the way, if cultural Christianity is decreasing, there is an opportunity for the church to develop its depth, and from that smaller core to develop a red-hot center that actually can be more fruitful in the long haul. In the words of Mark Sayers, he says, revivals burst from groups that are small in number, but strong in God's presence. And so I say this maybe as an encouragement to you today, if you are working in a context where you're working with less people now than you were 2 years ago. I'm not saying we don't care about the people who we're no longer working with, but I'm encouraging you that growth, revival, renewal can still come from the lives of the people that you're working with whenever they're small in number, but, and here's the but, strong in God's presence. We're strong in gospel intentionality or disciple-making intent, whatever way you put it. I've heard a little phrase a few years ago, I've remembered ever since, heat the core and let others get caught up in the flames. Heat the core and let other people get caught up in the flames. If people see something compelling at the center of our ministry or our churches, something attractive in our community, something compelling, then some people will want to come and experience it. And so actually maybe the heat at the center will draw people in. And what if we also began to look for ways to heat up the core in the hope that others get caught up in the heat, or develop a sense of community that others would want to come and be part of it? Just like the story Jesus told about the seed and the 4 different types of soil in Matthew 13, I hinted at it earlier. It's inevitable that some seeds will remain shallow. It's inevitable that others will get choked by the weeds. But the seeds that grow and flourish into crops actually have a disproportionate impact. What do I mean by that? In the parable, the seeds that grow and flourish multiply 30, 60, and 100 times what was sown. 25% of the crop survives, but 25% of the crop multiplies 30, 60, and 100 times, which means you're left with more at the end than you had at the start, even though 75% of the crop disappeared. Does that make sense? The seed that grows and flourishes can have a disproportionate impact. So what if in our disciple making we made sure, and I'm not saying we focused all of our time and energy, but what if we made sure that we were giving time and attention to a small core that we could invest in so that there would be gospel fruit and multiplication and fruitfulness. Does that make sense? So it's a question. Okay, there's the lovely phrase, heat the core, let it work its way out to the fringes. So again, this is a question for you to consider today. The question is, how are you balancing? Or what balance are you giving between the fringe and the core in your disciple making? Okay, and lastly, the need to equip. I think this pandemic has really shone a spotlight on the need and the opportunity to equip every disciple. We really need to think about whole life, the whole of life. not just the bits that people contribute to in our churches. You know, it's been said before that if someone's really committed to a church, there's a chance that they might spend 10 hours of their week invested in church activities. So they might come along for an hour and a half, 2 hours on a Sunday. They might sign up for an activity to serve in for 2 or 3 hours in the week. They might join a small group or some other ministry in the church. They might some leaders might attend a meeting. They might attend the church for about 10 hours, give 10 hours of their week to the church. If people sleep for about 7 or 8 hours a night, okay, and they give 10 hours to the church, that means they spend 110 hours a week doing some other form of activity. We need to equip Christians not just for the 10 hours that they spend leading an activity in the church, but for the 110 hours that they're going to be spending raising their kids, leading their family, being in business, teaching children, going about their everyday work. And, you know, in some ways, this verse that Jay highlighted to us earlier on is the call of disciple makers to equip God's people for works of service. That is not just the works of service in terms of preaching and teaching. That is also the works of service and ministry in all areas and all aspects of our life. The job of Christian leaders is not just to care or to do the works of the church, but actually to equip God's people for all of life. And I suppose as we think about this, I would love us to think about discipleship and even mission, not just in a controlled way where it all happens in the one place at the one time, but where mission happens in a dispersed way. So to give an example, Airbnb is now the world's largest. Airbnb is larger than any hotel chain in the world. They don't own any property. In our city, I don't know if it's big where you are, we have a company called Just Eat. Okay, so if you want to order fast food, you download the app, Just Eat, whatever takeaway you want, and they deliver it to you. Okay, it's the largest, it's the world's leader now for takeaway food in cities. Just Eat don't have any shops. Uber is one of the world's largest taxi firms now. In a city, if you want to get a transport, Uber, okay, download the app. They don't own any taxis. What am I trying to say? Sometimes the control is overrated. And ownership is even overrated. But how are we equipping and then kind of dispersing people to be missionaries and disciple makers in every aspect of their lives? Are we equipping people to make disciples where they are, or are they relying on us to do it for them? Where did Jesus' ministry happen? It happened in dusty streets and grassy hillsides and ordinary homes and busy streets, empty fishing boats. And Jesus takes these ordinary, everyday uses and he turns them into platforms or pulpits or opportunities for the kingdom of God to happen. So where do we think discipleship happens? It's going to happen in ordinary places and ordinary people, and I believe we need to equip people for it. So is our focus on enrolling and enlisting people for church activities, or are those church activities equipping people for cultural engagement, engaging as followers of Jesus in the culture? The need to equip every disciple. So maybe that's just a reflection for you today, is how much are our activities equipping people for their everyday life? How can people be equipped for business and their world? How can people be equipped as parents, as Christian parents, as disciple makers? And maybe we begin to group people not just by age or even by gender, but we could even group people in little discipleship cohorts that are focused on how they could become better disciple makers of their young children, and grouping people in ways that they could discuss that or explore that together for a year. You know, or as I say, business people or people who are medics or whatever. Maybe there's a way a way to equip people. And that could be relational based. It could also be maybe course based for a short time, or even just in our application as we preach. How are we equipping them for their everyday life and beyond when they're with us? I had one more, okay, but I'm not going to talk about it, okay? It's the positive one. But I hinted at it earlier, the nature of a stronger strain of discipleship. Shameless plug, okay? If you want to read more about it, I wrote a book during the pandemic and released it last year about resilient discipleship, and that kind of explores it. It's on the bookstall.